Thank you so very much for coming to this Noise in the City panel. It's interesting because a friend of mine who was really into Sex in the City thought that this would be as interesting as Noise in the City. I had completely forgotten about that TV show when the title came to my brain. But thank you for coming out on this Thursday evening to be present at a session where we're talking about something I think that's very important to so very many people. I mean, I live in Gastown, but my friend lives in Burnaby, and another friend lives in Maple Ridge, and another one. I guess don't know if you have noise in kids, but it doesn't seem to matter where we live in the metro area. Noise is a problem, and it's tiring. It's actually quite exhausting for those of us who live in it. In fact, one of my colleagues who lives in East Van walks around with earplugs in his ears, and it's until we actually knew that, we thought he was just ignoring us when we would say hi, but he didn't see us and he would just walk on by. But because it is when we spend time on the streets and in our neighborhoods. So I'm really thrilled to have present with us today a panel of 4 experts, all coming to the question of noise from a different perspective and different backgrounds. Hugh Davies, here, is from UBC. He's a scientist, associate prof, and he has studied the whole thing about environmental, the connection between environmental health, noise, and health. He studied lots of other things as well. But he also just told me that he actually has made it to a David Bowie concert. And so I think that's really kind of fun to know. The noise wasn't too bad, eh?
Oh, no, that's pretty interesting. It wouldn't be the same if it was too quiet.
And that's right. And we have Carl Robb on the end. And he is an expert in environmental health. He's a consultant, a translator, and I would say an activist in numerous ways. So welcome to you. We have we have Hans Schmidt. Hans, welcome. Hans was my first connection when I was trying to come up with this panel. And what intrigued me about you is that you've been active in this Right to Quiet Society for over 30 years. And I didn't know that we had a Right to Quiet Society. The rest of you probably knew this.
You keep quiet. Yes. You're just too quiet.
So, and you've been active in lots of different things, so welcome.
Thank you.
And Barry Truex, who's a professor emeritus at SFU, he's an acoustic, in acoustic communications. You're actually a composer.
Also?
Yeah, as well. And part of the whole soundscape project that SFU has been involved with for, what, 30-some, 40-some years?
45.
45 years, and is now a worldwide project. So please welcome our panel. We're going to start off with Barry, and then we're going to go to Hans and Carl, who will do a co-presentation, and then Hugh is going to wrap things up for us, and then we will go into a time for questions and discussion. So thanks again for all of you for being here.
Okay. Thanks very much for the introduction and also the invitation. As you mentioned, the reason I came to SFU as a young postgraduate student in 1973 was to work with Murray Schafer, the famous Canadian composer who was a professor here in this new School of Communication, or Department of Communication Studies, as it was called then, to work with him on something called the World Soundscape Project. And I had absolutely no idea what it was about, but he said, we were, with characteristic modesty, he said, we're only doing the world's most important work. And it was contagious. And here I am 45 years later, and I never thought that I would, in fact, 2 years later be his successor at SFU when he left. And so my entire career has been involved blissfully at SFU because it was so open to interdisciplinary approaches, which are the kind of things that are needed for, first of all, the subject of city and noise and music and environment and acoustic ecology. It has been the perfect place. I've never wanted to be anywhere else. I often show this picture of SFU when I'm abroad lecturing on this topic, and I make a note of something that is probably obvious to us, but it's quite striking in this picture of how the city and the natural environment of the mountains and the forest and the sea are so close together. And of course we know the history of the tension between resource development and urbanization and the crawl. Probably today that picture would have more urban sprawl up those mountains and things like that. So we live in a very unique place where the natural environment and the built environment are intersecting, and of course the modernistic architecture that symbolize this. I also remind people abroad that this is where Greenpeace started, and there's always been a kind of environmentalist awareness in Vancouver and sensitivity. I guess our agenda was to try to get sound and acoustic ecology onto the environmentalist agenda, because there is a lot of support for it in general, but often sound doesn't make it into the list of concerns compared to air, water, and other forms of pollution. Schaefer's own response of arriving here when the university started in '65 was that famously he was very annoyed by the modern sounds of the '60s, and particularly seaplanes and boomboxes and jet aircraft, and these were his bête noire. And he actually started a course in noise pollution in 1968, and of course came up against the traditional block that those kinds of approaches, being anti-something, have usually failed or have not necessarily thrived because it didn't seem to involve enough people, whereas of course the soundscape does involve everybody 24/7. So he made the rather momentous change of idea from the negative side to the positive side of trying to document what was positive about the acoustic environment and to create any method that would encourage listening. In other words, put it down to the individual subjective level. So because this topic is normally would be approached from the sciences, engineering, medicine, health, audiology, those kinds of things, but we're in the Institute of Humanities and in the university. I hope you will bear with me as I just give some background from my point of view on three different models that have traditionally and now contemporarily been applied to this topic. The first is the traditional objective model of acoustics that is largely quantitative and has been developed over centuries for basically measurement of everything to do with sound, and then later with noise. The subjective, this is the turn that Schaefer brought to SFU, was to turn it totally into a subjective approach, like basically just flipping the whole thing on its ear. Yeah, on its ear, actually. That was better than I thought it was. By comparison, the objective energy transfer model that is the center of acoustics, the listener is really just someone at the end of the chain, right, who then hears something, and in fact is not necessarily a listener, but just somebody who hears, right? So that's why it does turn it around to the individual, and that's both its strength and its limitation, is that it tries to empower the individual listener, and then, of course, raises the question of how do you achieve an acoustically balanced community, right? Consensus, that difficult transition. Because I found myself, as did Schaefer, in this nascent Department of Communication Studies when it was still a very small home for academic refugees that were coming from very disciplinary approaches and were dissatisfied with that narrowness and wanted to establish something new. The communication program was so broad because it was information-based, not messages, but information-based, information exchange, and also being in a faculty of interdisciplinary studies during the 1970s, as a kind of birthplace or a nurturing environment for encouraging new interdisciplinary approaches. It attracted people from a lot of different areas, and still, that was one of the things that was most exciting for me, even though my background was both music and science, but I wasn't really comfortable going into a purely music program, even as a composer. So SFU provided this ideal environment for the academic approach with a new model that we're experimenting with called communication that was information-based. So on the role of noise, which is the main topic here, I want to start with something that is in fact one of the traditional ways of approaching the subject in a polarized way, music and noise. In fact, we're often throwing that traditional dichotomy around. So I thought it might be an interesting way just to focus, particularly from a humanities perspective, on this, because that dichotomy is the classic positive and negative, right? And it has been, music has been defined in the past, particularly in the 19th century, as being pitched and periodic. I'm thinking of Helmholtz here, describing musical sound as that which has pitch, whereas noise is aperiodic in the acoustic sense and is unpitched. Music is traditionally regarded as organized and structured, and noise is generally regarded as random and chaotic. Jacques Attali, in his Political Economy of Music, the book called Noise, Bruit, has this lovely phrase, at least in the Masumi translation, where the organizing and structuring leads him to suggest that music is an indication that a society is possible. Right? I love that phrase. It works in English, perhaps it was just as good in French, versus the violence that he described as representing noise, and in fact the sacrificial aspect of appeasing the violence in traditional societies was one of his points. The classic subjective analysis of music and noise is that music is wanted and noise is anything that's unwanted, leaving huge gaps of how to determine that other than at the individual level or even in the particular context. Music is generally regarded as of human origin, and noise, of course, occurs in the natural environment through wind and water and earthquakes and storms and so on and so forth. But is it also intentional versus just being a byproduct of things? We say noises in a non-pejorative sense. There's the noise of a door closing, for instance, something like that. Generally, we think of music as stimulating and enjoyable, and noise as a stressor, which the health effects, I'm sure my colleague is going to give us a lot more detail on that, which is surprisingly not known in the public. I mean, after 45 years of teaching, I'd be hard-pressed to remember a student who actually knew anything about the risks of noise arriving at the university. Like, where is this? What they did remember was parents telling them, oh, you're going to ruin your hearing with that rock music. That's what they do remember being told. But that's not very useful. But on a theoretical level, this continuum here is, I've never seen, and I would love to know in someone, since the literature on this is vast, has anyone really figured out where that threshold is between when even the same sound is stimulating and enjoyable and when it becomes oppressive and a stressor, right? It's a continuum. Where's the dividing line? Where's the gray zone in there? It's something that shows that this traditional dichotomy breaks down very quickly, right, as we'll see. In the past, music has been a foreground signal, not something that you just simply have in your ears as you wander around, whereas noise is sort of the inevitable background when it's called ambience. Schaefer used the term keynote sound, drawing on a more or less musical tone as something that is common to the background and not paid attention to. So a little bit of psychology, foreground, background distinction, and the way that works. Basically, music is, when it's familiar, is cognitively predictable, and therefore that helps to make it more enjoyable, whereas noise is cognitively unpredictable, and you're more likely to be annoyed by something that's unpredictable than by something that's regular or steady or so. Now, that dichotomy, which is familiar to us, although it still has, as you can see, a lot of implications, has been inverted many times. For instance, music as noise, all the famous stories of street musicians and vendors and things in the early centuries that in fact became the source of noise complaints until technology provided much more potent examples of noise complaints. Amplified music in the 20th century would be an obvious one. Unfamiliar music or musical innovation. I don't know if you know Nicholas Slanimsky. He published the famous Lexicon of Musical Invective, right? Showing all the critical reviews of now famous and established composers over the years. Doesn't matter who it is, Beethoven, Wagner, whatever. Everybody has had critics that called their stuff noise and used colorful language and metaphors for it. I want to make a name drop here to Hillel Schwartz, one of my favorite independent academics. He's actually a historian, and he's adjunct at UCSD La Jolla, I believe, but he said the only reason is just to get access to interlibrary loan, because he is a meticulous historian. He has his books, particularly Making Noise, the encyclopedic, almost 1,000-page compendium is a wonderful book to read because he's found documentary evidence from all over the place that are not the usual cliched examples that we normally get. And just one of literally hundreds that's in there is from the 18th century, the Chinese court listening politely to the music of their French guests, like the European music well enough, provided there be only one voice to accompany the instruments. But as for the most curious part of our music, I mean the contrast of different voices of grave and acute sounds, that's high and low pitches, they're not agreeable at all to their taste, appearing to them as a confused discord. So classical Western music, at that colonial period, right, even there, we always think of it the other way around, that we don't understand, the music from other cultures, but they might not have understood, okay, this is before globalization hit, obviously. Noise as music is also interesting. I won't go through all of this other than to say that in the 20th century, one of the themes was incorporating noise elements in a very avant-garde way, futurists Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, Georges Antheil, and others. But it's also the source of new information and new auditory competence, right? This is a lengthy review by a critic named Paul Rosenfeld in the 1920s. I'm not going to go through it all, but in response to that noise music, this was so amazing that Emily Thompson, who's one of the best or historians of interdisciplinary approaches. This is about Soundscape of Modernity is from the opening of Boston Symphony Hall to in the late 19th century up till the Rockefeller Music Hall in the 1930s, and with the figure of Wallace Sabine, the father of modern architectural acoustics. But she also quotes the city noise, of course, the famous 1929 first noise study of a city, New York. They got to it first for obvious reasons. But at the same time, there was radio and media happening, right, which added to the whole situation. And then noise music itself. And this reviewer, a vanishing breed, obviously, actually found that noise music stimulating when he went back out into the city. So maybe by now you've read it. And I'll just end up this section by saying two things that I've been involved with that show the mediation between those two extremes. Music as environment. So we've had, for all of our lives, certainly, this can be traced back where music as an accompaniment medium, both in public and private spaces. Ursula Franklin made the wonderful comparison because she was very much against background music, or muzak, which was the thing she was specifically referring to at the time, was an invasion of the commons. And she used that example of that the acoustic environment should be a public space, and that it had been now appropriated by MUSAC. And it's a difficult situation to talk about. I'm sure it'll come up tonight. But on the other hand, from when she was talking about it, we now, of course, have the iPod generation, where now it's by choice, and it takes away from the involuntarily being exposed to background music in shopping malls and all the other places. So that is a very active debate. And the last is just a little shout out to my area, favorite area of creativity, which is environment as music, called soundscape composition. I regularly do 8-channel and multiples of 8-channel compositions everywhere that I get invited or go, that create both realistic and sometimes imaginary environments to give people an alternative of an acoustic space that has been, let's say, aesthetically designed. At least that's the way I look at it. On the other hand, I've done enough media interviews where this topic is, so you make music out of noise? Well, I wouldn't put it exactly that way, but we could start with working with that idea, right? So it still intrigues people, right? For, either from an ecological perspective, as a practice, as an artistic practice. And of course, for me, it's been ideal at SFU because the School for the Contemporary Arts and the School of Communication both welcomed this interface for me, and soundscape composition exactly brings the social and the cultural and the creative together. I'm not going to go obviously through this chart per se, other than we might want to come back and look at it as particular methodologies that each one has. I really wanted to just emphasize this part here. The role of noise traditionally in the absolute tradition of acoustics and acoustical engineering has been concentrated on the negative effects and response, or negative responses in terms of damage, stress, annoyance, interference. It's been largely quantitative and very much risk assessment oriented. I'm very happy to say that particularly in Europe, the younger generation of people coming out of that tradition are embracing more qualitative approaches, which are absolutely necessary and I believe much more quality of life oriented. So they are starting to use things that were maybe more traditionally, if I can say that, a soundscape kind of approach. The role of noise in the soundscape was either what Schaefer used, this rhetorical metaphor of the lo-fi soundscape, but it was basically anything about negative listening habits or non-listening habits, right? And this whole problematic thing about music as environment. From a communicational perspective then, which is starting to also get into the research literature here about not just quality of life or pleasantness of sounds or desirability of sounds, but information. What information? Because this is what the communicational model for the acoustic community is. It's not merely having pleasant sounds or non-pleasant sounds, but informative sounds and making sound a part of your connection to the environment, connection to people, because that's what sound is basically it links us to people and family, friends, community, the whole thing. We all know the things that can work against that, both for technology and noise issues, but some of the roles in the information model would be that it obscures the auditory image, reduces information definition, clarity, and so on. So as opposed to being just merely unpleasant, which gets you only so far, although it's usually a good motivating start. And then the coping or adaptation or coping strategies that individuals might take. But basically then noise would be a negative mediation instead of the positive part, which is what the soundscape approach is. So I just want to also finish with a little shout out to the World Soundscape Project database, which is available online, and all you do is send me an email, truax@sfu.ca, if you want to have access to it. It has the entire tape collection, all of the publications, video, interviews, lectures, interviews, my teaching documentation, and basically the history of course, it starts with the history of the project here at SFU, this iconic picture from the 1973. And I always like to show you my students who reinterpret it, looking much more cool and hip and having very portable equipment in 2010. Right, and the Vancouver soundscape, the original 1973 recordings that were then reissued on a CD, and double CD along with the 1996 ones, and also in the tape collection of the various eras. We have Vancouver from the 70s, from the 90s, and 2010, 11. And when you go into it, this is with the online version of it, not this. Then you get an interactive Google map and you can go from a recording made in Kitsilano in 1973, and then switch easily to Kit's Pool or whatever in 1993, and to the Olympic Village in 2010, whatever it is. And these push pins here in the different colors show the different eras in which these recordings were made, particularly for people who are not familiar with Vancouver geography. So that's just a really quick little look at some things that have come out of the soundscape work at SFU that I've been involved with. So thank you for your attention.
Now, I suppose being my turn, thank you very much for coming out and listening to us, rather than just hearing us. I have written in my bio that I have been with the Right to Quiet Society since 1985, which is a little while, I suppose. And over the years, we have encountered an awful lot of things, and it was a really good learning process to go through all that, which I had never imagined before, because before I became paraplegic and settled in order to be involved in things like this, I was out working construction and doing other things. My awareness was totally different about noise and sounds than it is now, after having been with the society for over 30 years. And so, over the course of years, we have met Barry Truex, we have met Hugh Davis, we have met many other people, Mary Hodgson from UBC as well, who spoke at our AGMs at different times, and which was very interesting. And to give you a quick history of our society, it was established in 1982 here in BC, registered, and it took almost 3 years to also obtain the charitable status with Canada. At that time, it was the Mulroney government. No, it was another government before Mulroney came in. And then finally, when there was a change in government, all of a sudden, the society was granted the charitable status, which was a good thing to have, because it gives you authenticity, and it shows people that indeed they are not cheats or they are not scammers, which was very good for us. And in the very early stages, in the very early years of the society, it was a small group. Well, we still are a small group. And the founder of the society, a retired lawyer at that time, he and 5 or 6 different people, they were sort of organized and working together, but all the bulk of the work fell on just the one, the founder. He had to do everything. And the first newsletters they produced was just a one sheet of paper with sometimes 1 page only, sometimes 2 pages. And so we have come quite a long way in that respect as well. And then when I came on and I became actively involved in the society, I thought, if ever we have some success, we got to be somehow in touch with other people around the world and gather information that we can base our arguments on. And so at that time, in the mid-90s, 1995, I heard of a very large organization in Europe, and I contacted the secretary of that organization, who was a lawyer in Switzerland, Lucerne, and he sent me some information about them. But I also then heard about the Environmental Protection Agency in Germany, in Berlin, and I wrote to the man who was heading this department there, and he sent me a whole stack of copies of studies that he was involved with, And so this way we started getting more information that we could base our arguments on against noise, how detrimental noise can be in whatever circumstances. And so we slowly continued working that way. And also back in late 1995, I one day received a phone call from New York from a lady from the hearing society. There's a hard of hearing society there. They started with the idea of holding a noise awareness day in the city of New York. And then as other people heard about it throughout the states, they wanted to be participating in this thing, and it became a national day of noise awareness. And then they contacted us, would we participate? Oh yes, we will. So it became an international day of noise awareness. And so we, for our part, contacted other contacts in different countries. And so finally in 1996, the first International Noise Awareness Day was held. And it was quite interesting because we had no means to advertise it very much. Of course, commercial outfits, they go on TV, they go on radio, go in the newspapers and spend thousands and millions of dollars on advertising. We couldn't do that. So anyway, we held that first day anyway, without much ado. And so we continued. But it generated enough interest amongst members of the public that it became an annual event. So every day, every year after that, we held an International Noise Awareness Day. And I'll tell you something really strange, or rather funny. On the occasion of the 5th INA Day, I was called by CBC Radio and CKNW Radio for an interview on that occasion. And as I was speaking with the man, the interviewer from CKNW Radio, for a while, maybe for 5 or so minutes, 6 minutes, whatever, then already another man came on to continue the show, and before they cut the phone line off with me, I could hear the guy who interviewed me speak to the man, and he said, "What do you think of this guy? He made a few good points, didn't he?" And the other guy said, "Yeah, but I thought you were talking with Arnold Schwarzenegger." Can't help from my accent, sorry for that. So, it's in our work that we do, we are not, as a charity, we're not allowed to do a lot of lobbying, political lobbying. Our charitable status restricts us in that. We can do something. We can approach politicians and ask for this or that, but no real heavy-duty lobbying. We're not allowed to do that. But what we do mostly is just give out advice and give out information, and we try to get education out. And this is something very difficult that we have run up against the brick wall all along. First of all, still in the 1990s, we tried the Vancouver School Board. Could we get maybe some soundscape education into schools? No, there was absolute silence. So I turned to the Ministry of Education in Victoria, sent them a letter, sent them a second letter, and there was each time complete silence, not even a reply of having received a letter. So I thought, well, this way we won't get very far. And so I thought people that I knew and who knew teachers in schools, some of the teachers were actually interested in having something like this in their school, but they couldn't introduce it because the school board wouldn't accept it. So we still have no comprehensive soundscape education program in any of the schools anywhere here, except for New York. New York introduced one, which is interesting. So we kept on working. So it's education that I think is so important, and that Barry also mentioned, that if you don't educate people to get the understanding what it means, then how are we ever going to change the soundscape? I mean, the quality, protect the soundscape, which in my opinion, soundscape is an integral, indispensable part of the environment, which requires the same protection as everything else, all the rest of it. And unless we get people to understand this better, we are not going to have much success. And Hugh was speaking at our AGM a few years back and showed us some very interesting information there. And we are always looking around for this type of information, as I said before, to base our arguments on and to use to inform people, inform the public. We have a website with which we have a bit of trouble now because it's an old-fashioned website, and the host of the website wants to change it all to more modern things, and more modern things are not compatible with what we have. And so we are struggling along there and see, maybe we can get a different host altogether, but we'll see. So of what we have on our website, we hope that, well, since the whole world can see it if they want to, whoever has access to the internet can learn a lot from that. And in the newsletters, we always try to put in information, soundscape information based on these studies, so that people will learn about what's happening. And so this is mostly our activity, giving out information and advice. And by our title, Soundscape, often neglected and poorly understood. Well, there you have the explanations. Sound is not like other type of pollution. Sound is a physical phenomenon. If it were any kind of a toxin in the environment, everybody would be up in arms. Oh, no, we can't have that. Or if you would, for instance, have a very nauseating smell somewhere, well, you would quickly have something done about it. But noise? No, well, we don't know about it. What effects does it have? Ears don't bleed, very unfortunately. If ears would bleed, oh, that would be everybody crying up and loud. But no, ears don't bleed. Hearing damage comes on usually gradually, save the very extreme case. And by the time people notice it, well, it's too late. The damage is done. It can't be repaired. So we try to avoid that by educating people, but we run up against brick walls when it comes to education to get into schools. And in my opinion, we should actually be able to reach all levels, from kindergarten on up to the adults, because they all should be educated about it to avoid problems later on in life. So the different types of noise, of course, I don't need to tell you very much. Everyone knows there's traffic noise, there's aircraft noise. Even as something subtle as wind chimes can be terrible if you have a neighbor with huge wind chimes chiming away every night and you trying to sleep. And of course, as it is in modern time, when I was a kid, well, everybody was working in daytime, people slept at night and was quiet. But nowadays, people can be working or sleeping at any time. So we also should have some kind of reasonable quiet at any time. And particularly deliberately made noise just for the whim of the person, to satisfy that person's ego, is the worst kind of noise, in my opinion. There are the boom cars, there is deliberately altered mufflers on motorbikes and those hot rod cars. So this is noise that I consider totally unnecessary, serving no positive purpose, and they should be outlawed, really. For that purpose, we need not only education, but we also need legislation. And there again, we run up against problems. Noise control in Canada is mostly left up to municipalities. There's preciously little at the provincial or federal level that we know of anyway. And many municipalities either have a council that doesn't really care very much about it, or they do have a bylaw. Like Vancouver has a fairly good noise bylaw, noise control bylaw. It's number 6555 if you want to look it up on their website. But enforcement is yet another big problem. So we are always running up against one problem that creates another problem, and we don't make much headway, but we can just keep on picking away on it. And different types of noise. Another so-called vanity noise is the misuse of horns, of car horns. And Carl will tell you his pet peeve about these things, because he got startled once by one of these honks going off next to him. And he thought, well, there's somebody honking, somebody hitting me with a car. No, it was just somebody locking his door with the remote control. So I'll turn it over to Carl now and speak about his experience.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Make sure you have to turn the microphone so it's pointing.
Yeah, thanks.
Closer is better too.
Thanks. Okay? Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yes. As Hans just said, I do first want to say that I'm very honored to be here with these other three people. I don't consider myself a distinguished noise expert at all. I'm simply a member of the Right to Quiet Society, and I want to tell you a couple of stories. I was startled by that Explorer back in 2007, and I thought, well, this is weird because I've just spent 23 years in Europe and I never had this problem never heard cars honking when they were just standing still, walking or unlocking. And I said to myself, I'll just just call up the Ministry of Transport in Ottawa and ask them why they're certifying this crazy technology. And turned out, of course, that the Ministry of Transport isn't responsible for certifying vehicles, it's the provinces. And I said, well, no, I'm not going to call up 10 different. So I gave that up. And I just let it go. It was bothering me, and then I started looking at the internet, and I found the Right to Quiet Society. So I said, gee, I'm going to join. Maybe they can help. Well, they couldn't really help, but I decided to stay with the Right to Quiet Society because it's a very interesting subject, and I've never in my career really dealt with noise. I was in other aspects of the environment. Well, then about 2013, 2012, I was over in Berlin, and I went to see Wolfgang Babisch, who I think Hans mentioned, the guy at the Environment Protection Agency, and I asked him about this, and his word was idiotic, right, when he went in terms of this technology. And he was quite incensed, and he said, I'm going to find out for you why they have it over there and we don't have it here. And he did. He found that there was an EC regulation from 1961, European Commission. The new version is 2009, and it simply mandates that if you want to lock a car, you've got an optical signal. Optical signal. And but he went to his friend at the Ford Motor Company to find out a little more about this, because there's no prohibition of that sound. And his Ford friend said, look, we can read between the lines. We know that if we went this way, there would be trouble. So we don't. But the manufacturers, don't ask me how this technology ever started. Maybe somebody here knows. I don't know where it came from. But the manufacturers don't like it because they've got two markets. So they've designed a system with a switch, and most of these cars have a little switch in there with two positions. One of them is North America, and the other one's other. The advantage to that, of course, is that if you get a car, whether you own it or even if you rent it, and you don't like it, you just bring it back and they can switch it over so that it doesn't do that. I know, because we don't even own a car, and I had a fight with Avis once a few years ago at the airport, and they just took it over the garage, and 10 minutes later they came back with the same car and it didn't honk anymore. So there we go. That's the way things work with that technology. Now I want to show you. Then a year later we had an inquiry from a woman named Janine Botta in Brooklyn, New York, and she had found us on a website. And this woman is, in my opinion, the most knowledgeable person on the planet about this technology. She has spent years in her personal time, free time, developing a vast bibliography on this technology, and she has contacted government people, and she's contacted executives of the motor vehicle manufacturers, and on and on. And she came along and joined the Right to Quiet Society, and she also...
In just a matter of years, we've gone from this to this to this and you call this progress? Join us today at silencethehorns.org.
I want to give everybody here a little paste in. She designed these things. You put it on the window of a car. It reads, "Wish you could lock your car quietly. Cars can be locked without a horn sound, without compromising lock status or security." And there's a little link here, and I strongly urge you to look at this because it is just brilliant. 34 seconds. There's plenty of these things over there. Anyway, with respect to Canada, or with respect to the technology itself, Janine Botta in 2013 gave a paper at the American Acoustic Society of America, happened to be in Montreal, and that probably is the first and only paper on this technology, because up until that time there's virtually no academic, no environmental, no legal, no public health. There's just no information in the literature about this technology, and it's completely unregulated as well. There's just no it's a mystery. The Quebec government has, on their website for a while anyway, recommended people not use it, and sort of suggested to them that there are other ways of convincing people that your car is locked or unlocked. But it's a sad development. I want to conclude this first part of my remarks by pointing out that that is certainly a neglected part of the soundscape, and what it needs is activists. That's what it needs. And so far, we've only got one really strong activist, and she's in Brooklyn, New York. She was here in November at the ASA meeting in Victoria, gave a paper there on something else. And she also spoke to our AGM. Now I want to switch to the other part of the title of our talk, Too Often Neglected. That was the, and this technology does have a name. The most common name is remote, RKE, remote keyless entry. That's the most most used name for this technology. Okay, and that's the end of that. Now we want to talk about something poorly understood. And again, this is something which I am crediting Janine Botta. She came to me a couple of years ago and asked me if I want to work on a paper with her on the problem of why people don't really complain very much. There's all kinds of literature which shows that people who don't like noise don't really complain. Very small, very low percentages of complainers. Let me start. Yeah, okay, that just shows you the horn technology. I'm sorry, this slide. That just shows you the difference between the technologies that are the tasks that are performed by the horn in these two models of the Cadillac. Okay, now, here's my only, now we're into poorly understood. This is my only foray into a noise. I was living in Montreal, and you can read that quite clearly. The Air France spokesman was giving a talk at a rotary or something. They were trying to push getting landing rights. How about that? Where the population is healthy enough to take this every 3 days or so. Ungava Bay, for those of you not familiar with Eastern Canadian geography, is way, way far north, above the Arctic Circle. There's maybe 10 or 15,000 people up there. They're practically all indigenous, mostly Inuit. And this was certainly, it caught my attention, and I had a little fun with it, actually. In the newspapers, I used this question down below, arrogance or ignorance. How much healthier than the Southern Canadians are those people up there? Do they have some unique physiological characteristic which protects them from sonic boom? But remember, this is an Air France executive who was saying that in public. Anyway, Janine asked, why do so few annoyed persons submit noise complaints? Well, if you just look at the first 5 up there, you can almost just apply those to those Inuit people up in Ungava Bay, right? Just imagine you're living up there and you're getting the sonic boom every 3 days, not knowing the appropriate authorities. Well, that was right there. Believing it will not be effective to complain. Believing it's impossible to reduce. Lack of organized groups. Almost every one of them, you could imagine, would apply to those poor people up there. I want to focus on the second quote there, which I've already alluded to. That is that noise complaint data represent response of a small percentage of those who are actually annoyed. And when Janine approached me, she decided that she'd like to try to find something a little bit more useful than just complaint data, because complaint data is unfortunately what a lot of jurisdictions use to develop their policy and enforcement strategies. And when you're talking about a small percentage of the public, it doesn't make too much sense. Outside of that, there are other types of complaints. There are serial complainers whom you have to ignore, and so it's not a very good situation at present with respect to the development of noise policy. And Janine's suggestion was that we look at online commentary of newspapers, blogs, magazines, which would give us presumably a wider audience. We don't know if it is going to show anything interesting, but we had the suspicion that if we compared that online commentary in 4 different countries, US, Canada, the UK, and Germany, we might see some differences. My perspective, when she brought this up to me, I said, gee, that's very interesting. I'd like to work on that with you, and frankly, I think that your theory is quite possibly valid. You know, we should see what we can do. And I immediately looked into Germany because I've got a lot of experience in Germany. And I pointed out that in Germany you have more than 60 consumer products which are labeled with the noise output. 60 different types of consumer. We're not talking about just cars. We're talking about everything. Hair dryers. You know, and so that one could say that the German population would be more receptive to negatively receptive to the idea of complaining about noise simply because they're faced with that information on a daily basis. And so we did then collect a couple of hundred comments, and we had 5 categories initially: wind chimes, daycare centers, loud family neighbor, a wine festival. Okay, that one was in Berlin, and aircraft noise. But only aircraft noise is coming from some new flight path or from some change, because everybody's against aircraft noise. It had to be something which was new. And of course, there were cultural and social factors built into some of those. And so, for example, the wine festival, we couldn't compare that with any other country, so forget that. Was just a waste of time, basically. And we didn't quite get enough data to come up with statistically sound results, but 2 of we ended up with just wind chimes and the aircraft one. In the case of wind chimes, the German stuff didn't come out, so she decided to drop it. And there's a little suggestion that there were some association between country and attitude, but nothing particularly astounding. And the other one was the aircraft noise, and that was only a moderate association. I didn't do the statistics. She had somebody else in New York do it. And so the conclusion of this little study, which was presented at the ASA meeting in Boston, was we need a lot more research, right? We just don't have nearly enough data. But it's an interesting idea, and I hope she pursues it, you know, and to see whether or not one can find cultural factors affecting that propensity to actually complain. Okay, that's the title of that paper, if anybody wants to copy the title. And the lesson for me from this is that contrary to the first one, and the neglected one, this is poorly understood, and poorly understood doesn't need so many activists, it needs academics. We need more people studying these complex issues. We've got several here at the table, right? And we hope that there will be more study of this type to go in the future. Okay, that's all I have to say. Hans?
Now, I will very briefly mention a few more things to you, like...
Oh, sorry.
Okay, let's try this. Barry has already mentioned Mary Schaefer and the soundscape and all these things. And he also mentioned Dr. Ursula Franklin. And in 1994, on Mary Schaefer's 60th birthday, there was a conference held in Banff, The Tuning of the World. And Dr. Franklin spoke at that conference. And one interesting thing that stood out for me of what she said there was, when modern technology made it possible to record, replay, and amplify sound, the sound was all of a sudden separated from its original source. And that's something important to understand, because now all of a sudden it's possible for humans to take any kind of a recording anywhere in the most remote places of the world and make it into noise where it's not supposed to be. So there's one other big problem there coming up. And of course, modern technology industry comes up with new gadgets practically every year that emit all kinds of sounds, or if you will, noise, depending on what the situation is. So we are having a tough job to educate people and not misuse all that sound. Another thing I would want to quickly mention is, I always am disappointed when I hear news reports and people speaking. They don't distinguish anymore between hearing and listening, which is so important. And Barry knows a thing about that too, because he has been involved with that for so long. People have anything playing in the so-called background. Quite often it's even in the foreground. And what's the latest thing now, even on the radio and what have you, CBC or so, my favorite science program on CBC is infected with that too. There's somebody speaking, making a comment or giving a talk, and there's this distracting soundtrack called music, in quotation marks, in the background and often in the foreground. And it distracts me so much that I can't understand what the person is saying. So this is a terrible thing. But to conclude, because we have not much more time, Ursula Franklin is a Quaker. And the Quakers, they always observe a minute of silence whenever they meet, and on other occasions as well. And you think, well, 1 minute is not very much. On the media, we often hear they held a moment of silence. Well, how long is a moment? Could be 5 seconds, could be 1 second, could be half a minute, but a whole minute of silence to observe. I have observed people doing that, and I have also seen that how many people are really very uncomfortable with that. Silence is awful to the human mind. So I would like to put this out to you and make a little experiment. Could we allow 1 minute of silence? I may have counted a little fast, but just as well, it was approximately 1 minute. Can anyone tell me, did you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with that? When we open up for discussion later on, maybe you can speak on that and give us some comments. I would appreciate your feedback. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Oh, hi everyone. It's always concerning when your entire sort of 20 years of work is reduced to one box on your chart. It's kind of small. And your definition of noise, I just used one of them, but I'm going to use it again. So I'm going to talk a little bit differently. It's great. I was really excited to hear other people's perspectives, but I come from a purely exposure science perspective, and as Carl and Hans said, that Vancouver actually is a center of research in the health effects of noise. And we too are quite disappointed that it actually gets very little awareness here actually in Vancouver where the data is being generated. So I'll share some of it with you tonight, and I'm happy to come and share it with other audiences if you like. I want to start stepping back a little bit about talking about the biology of hearing, because it's going to be important to understand when we start talking about the health effects. Hearing, of course, evolved not as a communications tool, or with a communications tool as a very specific reason, and that was as a early warning system, a protective system for animals, and it's highly evolutionarily conserved across species, many species. So the early animals simply felt vibrations, and as evolution progressed, the ability to pick up vibrations evolved into what we have now as this incredible hearing organ with this ability to hear or sense this massive range of pressure differences, and finally distinguish between pitch, which allows us to hear music and other noise. But our brain still has two distinct pathways, one that goes to the hearing center, which you're using now to process the sound into my voice and listen to me speak, but the other goes right into the deep part of your brain and is there as a holdover, and well, you still use it every day, as part of this early warning system. It's what gave Carl his shock when the horn went off. It's part of your arousal system. What gets you up in the morning when your alarm clock goes off. Right? You can close your eyes when you go to sleep. You can't close your ears. Your brain is listening 24/7, and part of the brain is responsible for distinguishing what's important and what's not. Now that's going to be important when we talk about the health effects of noise, because a lot of the issues, or a lot of the consequences, the adverse consequences of noise come from that relationship with the parts of the brain other than the auditory cortex. I would say Gary Larson has a cartoon that describes every scientific principle. So this is the acoustic, the startle response. You know what's going to happen next. That's what Carl would have looked like when the horn went off next to him. That's the startle response. Okay. It turns out that people habituate to noise. You all say, "Oh well, I moved next to I moved to a new part of town. The trains kept me up for the first couple of nights, but now I just sleep through it." That's habituation. But it turns out that you can never completely habituate to noise. There's lots of experimental data that show that the slightest novelty in the sound, its predictability changes, or the inability to predict it changes, and the novelty, any sense of novelty will at least, might not elicit this kind of level of response, but your body is still reacting to that noise signal. And so anyone that's been on a BC ferry, you stand on the outer deck, the captain says the ship's whistle is about to sound, and so you know it's coming, but 90% of us will still jump when the ship's whistle sounds. So these two pathways that I talked about, the one that goes sort of more or less directly to the acoustical cortex, and then the one that goes into the sort of arousal part of the brain, gives us this model, which actually was Wolfgang Babbich's model. He first proposed it. He's just retired, by the way. But yeah. He proposed this as giving us sort of two pathways where noise can cause stress, and I'll talk about the sort of sequelae of the stress later. But the indirect, what I've called indirect here, that's you listening to me now. So that's you sensing the sound, processing it, appraising it for its content, and then basically deciding whether it's noise or not. So you have an appraisal step in there, where you make a cognitive decision as if this is noise or not. Now, this is where I talk about, I have this very simple definition of noise, and one of the ones, noise is unwanted or harmful sound. And it serves us well in describing a model like this. So an example that I give my students is, you're listening to the TV, it's your favorite TV show, and you're enjoying it, you've got no stress, no annoyance, you're enjoying it, but then you decide you're going to shut it off and do some work, so you turn off your TV, and now you can hear the exact same TV channel, but it's coming from your neighbour's apartment. So there's nothing changed about the acoustical signal at all. If anything, it's lower. So it's nothing to do with the magnitude of the signal. It's actually quieter than before. But now your annoyance levels go up, the stress goes up. So what's happening there? Well, it's your appraisal of the signal that's changed. Right? So the other side, the direct side, this is the more insidious part. This is the signal that your brain is processing all the time. You may be fast asleep. Signals are coming in, a train goes by, a horn goes off, a loud truck goes by. And so what happens is your brain processes that, and even in those situations where you think you're sleeping through it, what scientists have shown that if you measure the brain activity during those instances of a truck going by or whatever, but a noise incident, your brain is reacting and your heart is reacting as well. It's small, but it's there. And so between these two pathways are happening all the time. When you're awake, it's more of an indirect pathway. When you're asleep, it's more of a direct pathway, but they're happening all the time. There's complex interactions back and forth. But the bottom line is the hypothesis anyway, the model says they lead to stress. And without going through the whole sequelae of what happens when you get stressed, but we have decades of literature that says stress is bad for you. One way or another, continued unresolved stress is bad for you and leads to many different diseases. So I'm going to go on to talk about that and talk about the work at UBC, but I just thought I'd put this notice up, or this note up from Scientific American, and I can't pinpoint the exact date, but it's sometime in the 1980s. So the noise and clatter which makes conversation almost impossible on many streets of New York, present time, will be done away with, for horseless vehicles of all kinds are always noiseless or nearly so. So this is points to the fact this is an ancient problem. The Romans knew about street noise and cobblestones and the baying of animals and tried to reduce noise. 100 years before this, they would lay straw on the cobbles outside hospitals because they knew that quiet was important for restoration of health. So we've known about the problems of noise and health for a long time. And in particular, we knew about noise and annoyance. And I'm going to show you an interesting slide on that. And you mentioned how people don't complain, but we do studies where we actually go out and do surveys of noise and annoyance. And so we have a pretty good handle on rates of annoyance, at least from certain noise sources, mainly transportation sources. So that's a kind of given. Sleep disturbance, again, we've known about that for a long time. Noise disturbs sleep, and that now we know more recently that lack of sleep can cause more serious health problems later. But what's been done over the last 30 or 40 years, and what captured my imagination when I was a graduate student and started working in this area, was this concept of noise and what we have been calling non-auditory effects. And it really started with looking at hypertension, because we knew that stress caused hypertension, and so it seemed reasonable to look at noise and hypertension, but also chronic heart disease. And I'm not going to go through all the results from all the studies, but this was a study that was done in 2005 of sawmill workers. And we had very good, clear results that both noise level and duration of exposure to noise in sawmill workers in British Columbia was associated with increasing rates of death from heart attack. So a clear, what we would call a monotonic response, a dose response, that the more noise or the longer you were exposed to noise as a sawmill worker, the more likely you were to die of a heart attack. Actually, this study replicates that, but this is community noise. This is a study that we completed around 2012, very large air pollution study. It started as, because air pollution, as you pointed out, gets all the money, and noise, can we kind of tag along and follow along, because they generate all the research infrastructure, and then we can play with it afterwards. This is a study of close to 500,000 Vancouverites. It's basically all the adults in Vancouver aged between 40 and 80. We have a marvelous resource at UBC that we can tap into, and what we did was we followed these, basically, many of you were in this study, thank you. It's a study of health records, anonymized health records, which we link to noise exposure at the residence. Okay, I can go into the details if people are interested later. But what we do is we look at how noise in those people's homes affects their later health in life. And so we've applied this to a number of health outcomes. This is the results from coronary heart disease, so heart attacks and angina and things like that. And there's lots of data up there. But the important thing is that one of those is looking at air pollution, which is the sort of no-brainer that everyone studies and everyone looks at and says, yes, air pollution is linked to heart disease. But that's the white dots, the black dots. But you can see noise is tracking along with it. It's equally as harmful as air pollution with respect to coronary heart disease, at least in this Vancouver study, and it's been repeated elsewhere. This is our latest study. These aren't in any particular order. Diabetes. So stress has been linked in other studies to diabetes. This relates to a change in hormones, stress hormones particularly, but also a change in the way that metabolism works in people who are stressed. And this is, again, I'm not going to go into any detail, but you can see a very clear, there's an increasing incidence of diabetes in this same population, 40 to 80-year-old Vancouverites, with increasing noise exposure in the residence. Okay, one of my slides has disappeared, but that little white box over there, adverse birth outcomes. So we, in addition to the adult cohort, we also have data on all live births in Vancouver over a 3-year period. It's about 70,000 births. And the health regions here keep what's called a perinatal database, so they collect data on the mum and the child, or children if it's twins, born in British Columbia. So again, we were able to link the information on births to the exposure to the mum for the 9 months when she was pregnant, based on the residential history that is captured in the hospital data. So unfortunately, the data, you can't see it for some reason, but what we clearly showed, as one of the main results, is that babies born to mums who are exposed to noise during pregnancy weigh less. They're smaller. It's not much, it's a matter of about 20 grams for the mean, but if you imagine a distribution of weights, the mean is the middle weight. If you shift the whole distribution of weights 20 grams lower, you're pushing a whole bunch of babies that were right on the edge of being a healthy baby into that unhealthy area. So it's small, but it's not insignificant. And there were other effects that we showed also with relationship to size given the gestational age. And then this last one is actually a study I was involved in London, a European study which looked at reading test scores amongst grade 6 students. And again, that's aircraft noise on the bottom going across from left to right. And what you see is as the noise levels increase, and this is noise at home for these kids, their reading scores drop. And the impact was around 6 months retardation in their reading scores. That's huge, right? That's like half a school year. difference in the kids that are exposed to a lot of noise at home. And then there are other interesting studies on things like accidental injuries, where people, after they've been at work at a noisy job all day, tend to be more likely to have a car accident. Okay, so that's the health effects. So the point I really want to make is, apart from the fact that there's a lot of work being done right here in Vancouver, is this breadth of health effects that we now can associate with noise. It's not just annoyance, it's not just sleep disturbance, it's not just even heart failure and hypertension, but a lot of diseases that are probably all mediated through this stress reaction. There are other things involved, lack of sleep for one of them in some cases, but okay, I'm going to wrap up quickly here. The other thing, we've talked about lots of sources of noise. These are huge population level studies. We're limited in what kind of exposure data we can collect. We can't collect data on noisy neighbors, horns, and so on. What we measure is transportation noise, and this is basically what's done. It's the standard for these kinds of studies around the world. Cars, trains, and aeroplanes. I love this picture. It's a composite of all the aircraft that landed at at Vancouver in one day. So what's interesting about that, and what gives you a sense of the complexity of noise, which kind of comes back to what Barry was saying, is that noise is this incredibly rich, or sound, it's this incredibly rich phenomena, is when you, the bottom of this graph is exposure to noise, so this is increasing decibels from left to right, and this is the percentage of highly disturbed population. So if you pick any point on that graph, but let's go right out to 70 decibels, so that's quite loud, that's about as loud as I'm speaking now, 70 decibels. The percentage of highly annoyed people goes up depending on what the source is. So rail traffic is the least annoying, road traffic is in the middle, and then air traffic is at the top. And we've actually put wind turbines on this, and wind turbines is even higher than air traffic. So this is getting at the point of how complex these noise sources are. It's not just about the level, it's things like the pitch, it's the predictability, it's what we call the rise time, like how quickly does that noise go from 60 to 70 decibels and so on. In the bio on me, it said that we produced a noise map. You're some of the few people that have ever seen it. It's used in our health studies. What we did is we spent 2 years modeling noise around the city. And this is just, you may recognize that kits. So yes, it is noisy in kits, whoever asked that. Because the first thing a scientist wants to do is when you create something like this, you want to look at where you live. So this is where I live. West 4th, Broadway, and so on, and there's Granville Island. So this map was created, it's a modeling exercise. As I said, it took a long time. We got the entire metro-Vancouver area modeled for 2003. And it's actually on a 10 meter by 10 meter grid. So this is how we estimate noise exposures for these big population studies. If you live in Kits, we can sort of figure out where you live based on your hospital records, and then we pull out your noise exposure off of this map. The noise levels, as you can see, vary quite a lot, and in this model, it's being driven by road traffic. So if you live right on a busy street like Broadway, I mean, there's less residences on Broadway and West 6, but they certainly exist. But if you go out to somewhere like Grandview Highway, is a really interesting street because it's like 6-lane highway basically with small kind of Vancouver specials on both sides. You know, it's noisy. I mean, we've got data there that show you there's barely even any decline overnight. You can't see rush hours or anything. It's just this sort of monotonic noise. But you can also see these quiet areas, the dark greens. So quiet also does exist in Vancouver. You just have to know where to find it. And getting away from streets is good. So just to end and sort of tie this up, again, Hans and Carl said, is we do a terrible job in North America on regulating noise. It's all done at the municipal level. It's all aimed at annoying noises like leaf blowers and barking dogs, where what this evidence shows from our studies here, but similar studies across the world, is that noise is a serious health issue. The Europeans have just published, this is an update, the environmental noise guidelines and then their noise guidelines. The Europeans are way ahead of North America in this, in terms of policy and research funding and so on. They have set targets for lowering noise, for target noise levels. You can see here the red areas are up around 77 to 79 decibels. The European guidelines are 40 decibels at night, which is really low. They've set an intermediate target of 55. And at that level, they suggest that we can minimize some of these more harmful effects. But there are millions of people exposed to these levels around in Europe, and certainly hundreds of thousands in North America, even in Vancouver. If you want to know more about this kind of research that's being done, both of these books are very accessible. They're free, they're World Health Organization books. You can find them on the internet, and they're very readable. So I recommend you have a look. And I'll stop there.
Stand here. Thank you so very much, all of you. We do have some time for questions and discussion. Yes, over there, please, and then over there.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to all of you. Hugh, I was especially interested in what you had to say. I've been living in the West End for over 20 years, and I've lived in, I think, 3 or 4 different places there. And the difference in seaplane noise is astonishing over that time. And I've also heard from people living in sort of South Falls Creek area that, you know, one of the seaplanes, kind of the scenic route is circulating. In summer, it's extremely frequent. Like, I counted one period where I was at home from about 7 to 8 at night in the summer, July or so, and it was literally quiet for a total of 7 minutes in that time. Also because of helicopter traffic, but that's less of a concern. It's less frequent. So I'm wondering on what your thoughts are as to whether there's anything we can do about it, and has it been well documented that this is it's stressful. And it's, you know, people think of their homes as their sanctuaries, places where they can recover from their hard working day, right? And you can't find that here.
So you went straight to our Achilles heel. The seaplane noise we didn't actually capture in our model, but we heard about comments like yours right away. Ironically, the aircraft industry has taken on noise reduction better than the other 2 modes of transportation. Reducing noise has been a consistent effort by the FAA and like Boeing and Airbus and so on. So the 787, the newest generations of aircraft, are incredibly quiet compared to the jets of the 1970s. Seaplanes, there's no regulation. Yeah. And if you contact the airport, who have a noise, a whole department on noise control, and publish data, they've got monitors all over the city, they're really concerned about their noise footprint, they will just disown the seaplanes. It has nothing to do with YVR. Unfortunately, we have I think it's the busiest seaplane terminal in the world, or one of the busiest. But I think, as far as I know, it just falls under these municipal regulations. I mean, they're just not regulated in the same way, because the regulations that cover the airport, there's two of them. One is to do with the aircraft themselves. Well, those aircraft were built in the 50s and the 60s, but they're maintained to keep them flying, so that doesn't count. And then the other one is more of like building regulations that say you cannot construct, say, a hospital within a certain proximity to the airport. So neither of those regulations help in the situation that you're in, and if you live, Dunbar is a flight route I know as well, and Knight Street. Yeah, it's a mess, but it's part of this problem. The regulation just doesn't cover it.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think.
While you're passing the microphone, I'll just add, I was on the City of Vancouver's Urban Noise Task Force back in the 1990s, and when we did the survey data of complaints and et cetera, they had to separate out the West End for the noise complaints, because it was so much more on seaplanes, right? So the city has known. I'd be curious if you called Fraser Health, who are the municipal people responsible for it, for environment, to what, because I know they'd be aware of it, but if there's probably jurisdictional, but is the city going to do anything about that particular source? Because it's been well known for 20 years in my experience with the Urban Noise Task Force. Thank you.
Okay. I'm absolutely delighted to discover there's a discipline called soundscapes. I think it's so important and it's so critical in terms of how I experience the city. Because in order to have a livable city, one has to be able to enjoy it. And I lived in west of Denman, it's in the West End, for several years, and I worked across the street from the Sinclair Centre. So in theory, I should have been able to take the seawall and walk home, or walk back and forth between the downtown and the West End. I couldn't do it because I couldn't stand the noise. And I realized there's a disconnect between urban planners and the soundscape. For example, the seawall is intended to encourage people to walk from home to work. But because of the floatplane terminal, it drove me nuts. I simply could not take that walk. And in the same way, some of the streets that are like Robson for sure, Hastings for sure, which connect the downtown with the West End, when I look at what was happening along the West End, the planners wanted these really wide boulevards, wide sidewalks, like maybe 20 feet of sidewalk for city cafes, to encourage this kind of street life. But for me to walk down Hastings, I simply couldn't tolerate the noise. I couldn't do it. And so there's this disconnect between a vision of having that street life and the actual process of, even if you have that infrastructure built, the noise is so awful, I wouldn't want to use it. So in terms of kind of pushing the edge a bit on innovation, I know that architecture at least, and possibly urban planning, I would suspect so, architecture is multidisciplinary. Like it integrates all the landscape architecture, urban planning, structural engineering, something called HVAC. Many disciplines are integrated within architecture. So it would be really interesting to see if soundscapes evolve into a kind of discipline where when people are designing the built environments, it's taken as seriously as, say, structural engineering. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, to me, I guess I'm sensitive to noise, and now I live in East Vancouver. It's just not livable if you can't go for a walk to unwind and you're dealing with congestion and noise. And finally, I had the most awful experience quite recently where I was waiting for the bus at Clark and Broadway. And Clark is we all know about it. It's an arterial corridor which is designed, so this is transportation planning as well. It's designed to take that container traffic from the ports out into the rest of North America and back. And I was waiting for the bus one day, and it was like every 3 or 4 minutes, this huge semi-trailer came by, or whatever they're called, with containers. This is inhumane. This is not a street built for people. It's built for machines, and it's just Broadway and Clark. It's just awful. So in terms of, maybe it's already happening, and I'll stop now, of seeing maybe soundscapes as evolving into kind of discipline where it's taken seriously within these multidisciplinary approaches to urban planning and architecture. So there it is. Thank you. Or in parts of my question is, how serious is urban planners and architecture taking soundscape not only as an area of research, but as a kind of applied discipline, an applied art or an applied science?
I would just say, having watched this develop over the last 45 years, the last 20 years, there's been much more of a generational change on that subject in architecture and urban planning. There is, I'm not saying everything's rosy, but I can see with the younger generation coming along and also other factors there, and particularly the way the Europeans are approaching it, that it is much more accepted, and there's a lot more interest, and it makes a lot more sense to people to have, acoustic design built in to all of these things. Yeah. Well, no, acoustic design, right. I mean, it may involve engineering, but it could also involve just urban planning and things like that. And the thing that you can basically, if you're lobbying for it, it's a quality of life issue that you were very articulate about. It's a quality of life issue, and basically maybe following Jane Jacobs, for instance, the sound on a human scale. She wasn't necessarily talking about the soundscape, but everything she did talk about as a geographer was applicable to living in a soundscape on a human scale. No one wants to live in quote silence in that sense, because that's the absence of life, or the absence of activity. But the sound itself should be on a human scale. And all your examples were ones that wasn't the case. And then we have the little Vancouver thing about the spectacular visuals and the horrible soundscape, right? That's particular to our city. Is as you're on the seawall, you're supposed to be admiring the wonderful mountains and the sea and things like that, and shutting out your ears, right? Shutting your ears because we're picture perfect, right? It's postcard. And also, you see in the real estate, the view lot, right? Do you ever hear this is a quiet neighborhood, right? Yeah. I mean, Vancouver has done stuff with traffic calming that it is actually fairly positive. I mean, unfortunately, that means the arteries get it, as you just saw on the maps, right? But did you notice those green and yellow areas that are in between? Traffic calming is actually helped a lot. And actually, it could be very quiet in the middle of the West End, for instance, if you're on traffic-controlled streets.
But I think, yes, I really like the idea of pushing that envelope of acoustic design.
Yeah.
As a really good discipline, right?
Yeah.
For applied design, because if you want to get out of cars, you want people to walk, you can't have them going nuts with all the noise around them.
Yeah, no, exactly. I do take some encouragement, though, from what I'm seeing compared to what it used to be like. So,
I wonder if any of you know, in terms of the emergency vehicles, the sirens, how unhealthy are they? Many of us have to block our ears as we're walking down the street. They can't be at a level that is actually safe. Does anyone know?
of course, they're not at a level that's safe. You want to argue against emergency vehicles? You're not going to get too far.
Emergency signals from whatever vehicles, be it firefighters or ambulance, police, etc. We have had many complaints, people turning to us, what can we do? It's terrible. And even in the night, when everything else is at least reasonably quiet, those sirens could be lowered so that they wouldn't disturb so much older residents wherever they go along. First of all, there's a law that says it has to be a certain sound level, it has to be a certain decibel level, because there's a liability. If anything happens, who pays? That's one thing on the legal side, the requirement for it. And the other thing is, because there's so much noise already around, people sort of block it out, learn to block it out, and no longer pay attention to it. So the sound level is being increased to get their attention again. And so it goes on. More people, more traffic, more noise. People block it out more and more. The sound level gets increased. Rather than making efforts to keep the overall sound level down or reduce it, no, it keeps on going up. Why? Can speculate on a psychological phenomenon, I suppose, because human beings, it's not cool to be quiet and inactive. And it gives the connotation that you are not alive, really. Yet, when you make a lot of noise and you're around and about, yeah, this is something, that's what everybody goes for. So there may be a psychological reason for it.
Well, there's also,
Could you turn it? Move it
yeah, sorry. There's also, I mean, Hans is right. There are these legal requirements of a minimum decibel level. But there's also research going on. Somebody contacted us a few years ago, or I picked this up somewhere, where there's some companies which are working on maintaining that decibel level, but using all intermittent sounds, as they do in Europe. The sirens in Europe are sort of horns that are intermittent, and they're still loud. And there's some evidence that people can deal with that better. That's what they're claiming. Yeah. I do want to say one more thing about Europe. I mean, I was promoting Europe also, and as you were, but to be fair, I think 30, 40 years ago, over here in North America, we were sort of on the right track until Ronald Reagan shut down the EPA. And the Canadian government said, wow, there's no EPA down there to deal with noise. Why don't we shut ours down too? And we did. Right. So there's been at least 30 years where neither country has any federal government agency dealing with noise. Right?
If I may quickly interject here, what Carl just mentioned about there's nothing in Canada. In the late 1990s, I wrote a letter to a person who was employed by the federal government to look at all these noise studies that existed until then and draw conclusions and say whether indeed this is a serious problem or not. And I wrote a letter to this person, Dr. Stephen Bly was his name, and the answer I got from all the studies that he has reviewed, there's no good conclusion. Can't tell really whether noise is detrimental as some people feel it is. So there we were back again to square one. And for what Barry mentioned, in real estate, when the real estate people advertise their buildings for the beautiful view and the beautiful location, but nothing whether it's quiet or not. Yeah. We have also another member of ours in the state of Oregon was very adamant about that, to approach real estate companies to include this quiet information in their advertising. And I wrote a letter to the Canadian Real Estate Association. No, can't be done. No interest.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in what's going on in Europe, because it is fascinating. So in 1995, I think, the European Union passed the European Noise Directive, which said that any municipality over 250,000 people had to produce one of these maps, right, which is why we were able to get the software and use it here, because there are companies that produce the software. Have to produce a map, have to identify prioritize hazardous areas, and come up with a plan to reduce the noise levels. And a lot of those maps are available online, so unfortunately not for North America, but if you know a European city of interest to you, and you can go on, you can find these maps, and you can put in an address, and you can see right there what that house's or the neighborhood's noise level is. And people have approached us to do the same thing for our map. It's literally a matter of funding and interest to do it. And now it's out of date, unfortunately. It's almost 15 years old. However, I'll plug, there is a massive national effort right now to map more Canadian cities. Project called CANUE, C-A-N-U-E, that's looking at environmental exposures, both chemical and physical, and noise is one of them. So we may see some more maps coming out. But this is the only one currently in a Canadian city of this size. And as I say, it's a bit out of date.
We've got just two more questions. Oh, three. Would you keep them a bit short?
Yeah.
That'd be great. And, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thank you all for speaking. I think one thing that I'm concerned of with, like, for example, my living situation, I live in Surrey, and I live on 152nd Street, which is a very long corridor, kind of similar to Grandview. Maybe it's like a mini Grandview. Yeah. And there's, like 5 or 6 new housing developments that are quite substantial. And as a result, like, first of all, there's the construction noise during the day. And then as a result, afterwards, there's going to be way more car traffic, right? And so, like, as someone myself, that I'm like conscious of like what this is happening to me, like prior towards coming here and learning more about it, which is actually quite shocking and a little bit like disturbing to some degree. Other than like, what can we do to like really make this more urgent to like, for say the city and like whoever else is like, calling these shots to like make these things happen, right? Because in the long term, like, obviously this is just going to hurt people, right? So like, your opinions on like what that can look like and what we could potentially do to like make this more of a thing.
You've been involved in the process directly, so.
You're asking a very big question. I mean, first of all, with our students, because particularly, Hugh gave one point, a data point about reading scores, but just apply that to all intellectual activity. And students are in this problematic situation of finding affordable, something called cheap, which doesn't exist anymore, affordable housing, and yet they're often in the least acoustically favorable situations, right? Basement apartments like on a main street or something like that, So, at a level of individual action, or anybody contemplating moving somewhere, go listen to it, before, and realize that it actually is going to have an effect on your academic work. Right, it's well documented in performance studies that the being constantly interrupted by random sort of noise things, not so much the quantity but the quality of the work suffers. Concentration, any long-term concentration. So, and frankly, look into earplugs, or noise-canceling headphones, right? But you have to be proactive about it. A lot of this, you see, this was what Schaefer found, back in the 60s, was that it leads to this fatalistic thing, nothing's going to happen, we can't do anything about it and all that. So he turned it around as a positive thing that was more, listener empowered, right, which was a good strategy for at least, now when the students say after our introductory class, right, oh, you've ruined my life, now I pay attention to all these things that I was taking for granted before, and now we say, now maybe you'll do something about it, right? Because if there isn't consumer demand, if there isn't individual proactive about it, if society in general doesn't care about sound, there's going to be no action, right? There's going to be no other political or social or economic action. The market responds to market forces, right? And if people demand or take it as a priority. So for us, that comes back to education, which is, of course, the universal panacea, right? And all of that. But it's, there is a room for a grassroots kind of approach to it in taking control over your own life and realizing what those effects are and trying to do something about it, and also maybe just using some good acoustic common sense, about not adding to the problem. Right.
I totally agree. I mean, the small things like the studies of heart health and so on show that even window opening activity, like people who open their windows and are getting more noise at night, have more health effects than those that like practice good sleep hygiene. So move, to a room that's away from the road, close the windows at night. Contact your environmental health officers. So all the health regions have medical health officers. The environmental health officers are more food inspection and stuff. You know, you might get someone who's interested in noise, but the medical health officers have to respond. We get probably lots of individual inquiries from people, that, just like yours, and some of them very specific, and getting them into the, you know, connecting with the health system, I think is really important. And there are some interested and willing medical health officers. Politically, though, it's just not even on the horizon at the moment. You know, it's just no one's really interested. That's the problem. I mean, you invited someone from the city here tonight, right?
I invited someone, but no one would come.
Yeah.
But I was a little wondering,
Are you
because
there?
back when we did the Urban Noise Task Force in Vancouver, it was Nick Lucito from Environmental Health, from Fraser Health, but in charge of the environmental thing. They were the ones that had the noise hotline, the number, and they were actually, he was of course burdened by the fact they only had like one or maybe two extra assistants to do it, and there were, you know, the workload, but it was in environmental health.
Right.
The actual city of Vancouver's.
In the city?
In the city, yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the health region, so Vancouver Coastal,
Okay.
Fraser Health.
No, but Fraser Health, it was part of Fraser. It's
Okay,
been
sorry.
incorporated into Fraser Health, right? I'm sorry that I'm not up to date on that, but I thought it was still a, you know,
No,
Fraser
I
Health.
tried to track it down because you told me that,
Yeah.
and I couldn't get in touch with anyone. We are almost at 8 o'clock, so I want to say there are more questions, and I think for those of you who want to stay for a bit, especially the ones who want to ask the question, and those of you who don't want to run off, but I do want to know that please feel free to leave if you've got other obligations, okay? We're going to carry this on for a bit if it's okay with you guys.
Let me just quickly mention to you, for anyone interested, we have laid out a few pieces of our literature here that might interest the young person. So please feel free to pick whatever you find interesting here on this table. And another thing is, maybe on too short notice, I emailed with Megan about the possibility that we would offer a few items to raffle off. Well, it was too short to make a raffle. So what I would like to maybe suggest is, we have this, Barry edited this book here, The Acoustic Ecology, way back when. There's one item. Then
It's a
there's-
collector's item. It has been out of print for 30 years. It's been transferred to CD-ROM and online, right? You know, so
A
that
couple of years ago, there was this
collectors.
very good documentary film coming out, In Pursuit of Silence. There was a young American fellow walking from New York to Los Angeles with his little cart all alone without saying a word. So that was really nice. But of course, along with this, there are other scenes in there and other comments made in there. It's a very good DVD film. And of course, our precious, very much looked after or sought after T-shirt. If anyone wants to have this treasure, we will give it off. And what I thought is, if our two experts here, because we're not really experts, we're more activists than experts, would ask a specific question of what has been already mentioned tonight here in the talk, the first hand to come up and correctly answer it can pick one of these items. Would that be all right to do?
Have you been paying attention? Oh, I should do that with my students.
If you don't object, we can do it this way.
Let me get in a place where I can see all your hands.
We're supposed to come up with a question about something we've mentioned?
Something that you have already mentioned here. If people paid attention, they would
my
probably
goodness.
remember it. I could think of one of them when we mentioned it.
Maybe you should do it. Maybe you should do it.
Hugh mentioned it, and Barry as well to some degree. Stress. So there are positive types of stress which stimulate and motivate, but there are also these negative types of stress which wear you down and are detrimental for your health. So what type of stress was it that Hugh has shown on one of his slides there, which was had very detrimental effects?
First hand over there.
So air pollution, aircraft noise pollution correlated to the effects of children, their retardation of their reading level by 6 months, behind 6 months.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
That's
So-
correct, right?
Yep.
Would you like to take a pic of these 3 items here?
Yeah, can I get the book?
Oh, yeah.
You can get it signed too.
Thank you.
Do you want an autograph?
Can you come up with any questions?
He wants an
Otherwise, we'll
autograph.
just stop
Yeah,
at that.
sure. Of course.
Oh, I don't know. It's so hard. I usually do multiple choice. The definition of noise is, my definition of noise was unwanted sound.
I know. No, there was one more part.
Okay.
Unwanted or
T-shirt or DVD?
And, or,
yeah,
harmful,
well done.
yes.
You were paying attention.
That's right.
Very good.
Can I get a copy of your slides?
And maybe then I will throw out another question that was not spoken about today, which is sound measuring. Sound has come to be measured in decibels, expressed in decibels, which is a logarithmic scale, which I, as a layperson, do not really understand. But we got a very good explanation from a retired UVic professor, who is also a member of our organization. And he wrote several articles on it, one of which is right here on paper. So we have decibels for measuring just a straight pure tone. We have decibels on the A scale, which is usually used for measurements, noise in public areas and so on. But we also have decibels on the C scale. Who can explain, would anyone of you know the difference between decibels on the A scale and decibels on the C scale?
It's not fair for me to answer.
Oh, yeah.
I don't really know too much about it.
Hopefully anyone who's taken my class, because that was one of the things we drilled into them, right? You know, the C scale takes into account low frequency noise, and the A scale discriminates against low frequency scale. And there's this very interesting, this is getting nerdy now, there's a very interesting reason why those scales were developed back in the late 1920s with the decibel, because they measured the hearing response, and at low levels the hearing fell off with low frequency. But then it started being used universally to measure jet aircraft and everything else, right? You know, along with other even more complicated kind of things. And the C scale was actually our hearing response curve at very high levels, right? So why wasn't the C level scale, DBC, applied, right? Because whenever, you know, an engineer is going to say, they first of all have to explain what is dBA, right? And they say, oh, well, it's the way the ear hears. Well, only at low levels. But it got standardized because it predicted results better, affect results, right? So all of these things, be careful about the scientific start, because they actually are constructed. They are constructed things that become norms. And the way they're explained to lay people is often very misleading, right? If you actually look at that, it actually had to do with the 40 Fawn curve in the original equal loudness contours. But that was at low levels. And you actually know that yourself. If you turn down an amplifier, when it gets down to the quiet level, the bass is basically gone. Right, so there's the paradox. There's one of the many paradoxes about sound, right? That is that the low frequencies, you know, you crank them up to high levels, right, to have an effect on your body. But in fact, it's the measurement scale dBA doesn't take that into account, right? I mean, there's counter arguments. I know what the counter arguments are about it, but this is why I'm saying, you know, because I had, you know, an undergraduate degree in physics and math, right, before I went into music, right? That's why I did this as an undergraduate text, you know, for trying to bring together interdisciplinarily all these terms and things and try to explain them, right? And interestingly enough, when SFU used to maintain stats on page references when we got it online, decibel was the number one entry that got consulted, because obviously everybody has trouble with it. So I don't know if you remember what I said about the WSP database. Send me an email and you can get access to it. truax@sfu.ca. It includes the online version of this and all the WSP stuff, all the other materials, because the other reference that was there, but I felt I should have mentioned it, is as the website for the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology, WFAE.net. It's a repository of all things that could be related to soundscape acoustic ecology, teaching materials, the journal, lots of good stuff there. It's and it's fairly easy to remember, WFAE.net. So those are two good references that are good for the general public, or people who are wanting to learn.
So we really have to be heading out of this room in a bit. So again, please. No. We've got.
Or just short. Okay. This was really good to know and to hear. But my view is, we cannot do. Even you in this action cannot do much to change what city, business, politics, whatever is doing. But could something be done, like through health promotion? I heard you cannot go to school and implement that, but have that noise awareness day, or maybe have a noise awareness week, and do same like awareness for using drugs or alcohol or driving or whatever, about noise, that young people know what they can do. I cannot change my problem in across my building that I'm not going to talk. I even complained to the city, and answer is, oh, they are okay. The standard in our city is higher than standard World Health Organization night noise or whatever. But if I know that I shouldn't put telephone next to my bed when I'm sleeping, that helps, or some other small stuff that young parents that raising kids know, and the children know, and that they grew up with awareness and some action.
Yeah, there's at least one program in the US that's targeting schools. You can look up dangerous decibels online. And I think the work that the Right to Quiet Society is doing, it's it needs more advocacy, for sure. But you also have to have someone that will listen to you, and that's part of the trouble, is getting in front of people to advocate too. But I think schools, they're probably ripe. There is some tools out there. No,
I was just thinking to have one day a year on TV, on media, at school, some schools, or health center, the local, that they can do. They have the health nurse or health person at school, or with help of this program, that they have some material that they can present to students.
Well, in July, there's the World Listening Day, International Listening. Yeah, no, but there is the International Listening Day, and it's done on Murray Schafer's birthday, right? And it has activities all around the world, but again, fairly low profile. There are monthly sound walks. The Vancouver Soundwalk Collective, offers sound walks pretty regularly, and they're really good to do. It's amazing how the sound walk idea, particularly as it's organized and led and interesting, can be done anywhere by any group of people at any time, and it's so simple and it has great results. And I know a lot of teachers that also are incorporating sound walks into where they can. Anybody who's teaching about sound or audio even, or other things, we don't get pushback on that. Everybody realizes. We've even had sound walks for urban planners and things like that at conferences. It's sometimes really simple things like that, and that's the simplest one, right, to do, other than just telling people to listen, right, is to take them on a sound walk, right, or a listening walk, if you want to call it that way. And it's so, because it's so simple, it can be done by anybody, anywhere, at any age group, right? And it's even an organized one in Vancouver more or less every month. So it's a great technique. Yeah.
I have a really, really quick question. So I am one of those people that cannot handle silence. I can't sleep in silence. And I recently was staying with my sister for an extended period of time, and she lives in a one-bedroom, teeny tiny place. So I was on an air mattress on the floor, and she was in the bed. And she can't sleep in silence either, but she specifically needs fans going on all the time. And I have to have actually human voices, so I would have the TV on all the time. And we were in one room, so nighttime was just the noisiest time in her place. And I'm just curious if there's any health issues with that, or if that noise has just become, like you said, habituated, that it isn't having those physiological effects. Because I really am somebody who's always plugged into noise when I'm transiting, sleeping at all times. And I am just curious, are we ever able to kind of get to a really restful state if you're constantly being stimulated while sleeping that way?
Yeah, I'm not a sleep expert,
Yeah.
but my guess is not. You know, if you're listening, if you need that sound, that means your brain's processing it. So at the very least, it's probably affecting your sleep cycles and the depth of sleep that you're reaching.
Yeah, that's definitely the thing that people aren't aware of, that they only think of sounds that wake them up.
Yeah.
But it's known now that it changes the sleep level. You don't get as much deep sleep, right? And if you don't wake up rested, right? And it can be as simple as just a few cars or trucks going by, right, for that. Now, you're talking about noise-induced sleep, which is a completely separate thing. I would say it depends on how loud it is. Yeah. Right, because you have no control over the fact that it will prevent you from going into the deepest sleep, right? Even though it doesn't wake you up, right? I'm sure there is some literature on noise-induced sleep, right, like that, and it could be looked up, but I wouldn't want it very loud because it could keep you from going into the deeper levels, which are, the theta and whatever they are, right? And it's you have to be really careful about that, because it's insidious that people living in these noisy, bedroom levels are supposed to be like 30 dB, and if they're higher than that, which is usually in poorer neighborhoods, right, and then people don't even realize that they're not getting the sleep that they need because they just feel not rested when they wake up, but they didn't actually wake up by any particular noise that startled them, right? But it's definitely the lack of deep sleep, brain patterns. Yeah, and then it gets chronic, right? So.
Have you ever thought about why you can't sleep without any noise going on?
Well, that's a whole other issue. We don't have to.
Because usually when people say they can't, it was too quiet.
Yeah.
It's because it takes 2 weeks to habituate to an environment where your brain says, that's not salient, I don't have to wake this person up. Because every little thing you get used to, as Hugh has also said, right? Yeah. And so it takes about 2 weeks in the literature I've seen before, when you're in a new place, what's that noise, what's that thing? Well, the brain is doing the what's that thing, all during your sleep, right? But so people who go to the country and say it was too quiet, I couldn't sleep, that's easily explainable. Because after 2 weeks they would adapt to that. But by then the holiday's over and they come back, right? So.
Okay, our last question.
Okay, it's not really a question. I'm an audiologist, and my background's in hearing health and noise damage. So actually, I have some information on that for you. So it's okay if it's quiet, because some people use noise at night for certain conditions, but it depends on, it's supposed to be a more ignorable type noise. I was just going to say that in the 1990s, WorkSafe BC partnered with the BC Ministry of Education and developed noise-induced hearing loss prevention modules for kindergarten to grade 12. Okay. I think they're still in the schools, but they're optional, so the teachers can use them or not use them. The other thing I was going to mention that might tie into what people can do is at the levels that the World Health Organization is recommending, at the 55 dB to keep the noise below that, is a level where communication's impacted for people with hearing loss or hearing health problems. So it is a disability rights access issue. And if that helps everybody else bring things down so that we have nice livable cities, it is good for everybody.
Yeah. That's a good point, a really good point.
Okay, I understand, sir, that you've been trying to get your hand up for a question. A long time, I'm sorry.
I just want to remark that I've been a radio operator for 20 years, and I've been listening And I think it's my attitude towards sound, because when I was listening to Murray Schaefer's recordings, I went out and made recordings myself of, grass, those machines that go across the grass, displaying water, and things like that, and railway tracks. They can be most interesting. So I have no problem with sound at all.
Because you paid attention to it.
I guess I think it must be your attitude towards it. Calling it noise is a big disadvantage.
That's true.
I guess that's
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our time together. Thank you, the four of you, and thank you, all of you here, and have a good evening. Sleep well.